I changed the title of the. I haven't changed the content, but I have changed the title because I thought continuous innovation sounded stupid. Like, well, that's sort of thing somebody with a beard from Shoreditch would say, isn't it? Like, maybe not. I don't know. But like, if you're gonna think differently, take anything away really, I just want you to sort of think about changing your perspective on how you work at the moment, and whether or not the way that you work is likely to create new ideas that have value, or is it likely to create more of the same, which is also valuable because the world needs more stuff. But if we're going to do innovation, we have to think differently and do things differently. So creating a different perspective on things is important. Lift it up a little bit. Okay. Okay. So brief introduction. So you probably haven't heard of Code Computer Love. They're based in Manchester. We've got a small studio in London. But the important bit of this is that I used to work for the BBC, and I'll say why that's important, because like I'm a design director, so I've always been a designer, and my sort of relationship with design, working at the BBC, was where I sort of really learned and honed the sort of craft of what I think user experience design is all about. And the best example I can give you is this. This is the first prototype for the CBeebies app. I don't know if any of you have young children, but CBeebies is aimed at kids that are between 0 and 6. And so designing experiences for 6-year-olds is relatively straightforward. They can do most of the same things that 7 or 8 and 9-year-olds can do. And so from sort of 4 onwards, kids can start to use phones and things relatively well. And as long as you make the buttons big, they'll be okay, basically. But CBeebies is not just for that group. It's really easy to super serve the older audience. And so how on earth do you design something for like 0-year-old kids or 1, 2-year-olds? What can they do? And so the way that we kind of figured that out was to go and visit a bunch of nurseries and watch them playing. And they played with toys like this. They bash things and they rattle things and they spin things and they chew things, and etc. And so in observing that, we realised that maybe the CBeebies app that we were designing could be joyous just in the sort of interaction with it alone. So it's got a big spinning globe and you can sort of whip it round. And so you can get some pleasure or engagement from the CBeebies app if you're really, really small. And it was sort of inspired by these things. And so that was a sort of favourite project of mine, and it came to define the way that I like to work. And it's about sort of going out into the world and seeing things for yourself and trying to empathise with people and all that kind of good stuff. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but it was the sort of thing that I built my reputation on. And we worked a lot with agencies. So the app was built by another organisation, and I worked with them to make sure that it did what it needed to do. And I thought that my job was to get people to do this, basically. It was kind of like the heavy lifting, the stuff I couldn't or didn't want to do. And so I would think my role was to be really, really clear about what was needed, give people direction, make sure that the thing came out the way that I kind of imagined in my head. I thought that the creative director's job was to do that, and the role of the agency was really to sort of basically lift and bring that to life. And the more direction I could give them, and the more sort of be clear on what my expectations, I thought that the better, really. And so I felt a bit sorry for them, because I thought, well, I'd never really want to do that job. I would love the job that I did, going into schools and messing about. And so I was never really up for working in an agency. But then I met a guy called Louis, who's the founder of Code, and he said, we're different. So we're a product studio. And I was like, okay, so that sounds interesting. What's that? And they said, well, like the world has changed. Like, clients are now looking for the sort of stuff that you do. That's what they want, is basically research and user experience design and methodologies, basically, that lets you kind of design things well, and not so much the sort of production side of things. They want that too, and that's important to get the craft, but actually it's the sort of origination is the thing that they're looking for. I was like, okay, well, that sounds quite cool. I'd like to have a go at that. And so I sort of signed up and started about 3 years ago. And the first problem I had was imposter syndrome, obviously, because I was sort of scared, thinking, like, am I actually going to be able to do this? At the BBC, you get a lot of freedom, obviously, because the type of organisation it is, and you're not on the clock in terms of day rates and things. And so I was thinking, well, is it actually possible to do what I do and charge for it a sort of significant amount of money, I suppose, and for the client to find value in that? And one of the first opportunities to do this with Centre Parks, and they'd written in the brief that they wanted all of the things that we could do. So they wanted sort of depth research and analysis. They wanted really progressive design methodology. They'd written this big list of sort of, it sounded ace. And so we dived straight into it. Here's me. The first thing that I did was like thinking, just like CBeebies, I'd go on holiday. And I went to Centre Parks and took my family there, and then I went and worked there for a bit. This is me and Jacob. He works in customer services. And we toured around the park just checking everybody's having a nice time. And they were like, you having a nice time? Yeah, you having a nice time? Great, okay. Giving people directions, that kind of thing. It was a fun day out. And then we stumbled across this little girl, and she was crying, sat on her dad's lap crying. And Jacob scurried over and said, well, what's the matter? And she said, well, I spilled all my sweets on the ground. And Jacob said, well, that won't do. And he picked up the pot and went back into the shop and filled it back up again and gave it to her. And she was obviously delighted, and she skipped away, and her dad skipped after her, like they just went and enjoyed the rest of the holiday. And we were like, what on earth's that? And he said, well, there's this sort of secret word that we have called surprise and delight. So if you spill your pint or you forget your swimming trunks or whatever, we just sort it out, because the cost to us to sort is way, way less than the cost of people having a bad time. And so Centre Parks has got this like secret surprise and delight that goes through absolutely everything. And so you'll notice if you go there. And I was like, well, that's interesting. So what's the equivalent online? And he was like, what? I was like, well, where's the surprise and delight on the website? And he was like, I don't know what you're on about. And so we went back to the team and said, you have this theory, you've got a really sophisticated like sort of physical experience, but it's not in the digital experience at all. And so we started to sort of put, you've seen this sort of stuff, so sort of service blueprints and things. We were able to sort of identify two things that we need to do: remove the frustration out of the work, out of the experience as it stands, and add something in its place. And so we started to think of the confirmation pages when you pay for something, less about a receipt and more about the beginning of something. So we'd sort of make a bit of a celebration of it. And we had all of these ideas sort of peppered through the digital that reflected what we'd seen in the experience itself. And so the research we did and the strategy that came out of that, we presented back to the client. And they thought at this point we were cool. And so we found all of these interesting things that we could improve. And they said, right, the next thing to do is to figure out how to design that stuff. And we want you to do design sprints. And so you might have, there's a famous book by a guy called Jake Knapp about his process called design sprints. And it's a way to really quickly prototype and test an idea. Really, it's really sort of divergent, so you'll come up with multiple ideas, you create prototypes, you test them and you learn and you sort of feed that back in. And when I was at the BBC again, we'd been doing this for years. It was like I was Mr. Design Sprint, so I was like, this is going to be brilliant. Like we're just going to get better and better. So we started the design sprints process, and I was doing it basically by the book. The client was involved. It was super collaborative. It was fab. And at the end of each day, I was like, that was great, wasn't it? And they were like, yeah. And then a couple of days later, I was like, oh man, we're having so much fun doing these design sprints, aren't we? Like, it's going really well. And they're like, well, I don't know. And so it kind of ticked along for a few weeks. And eventually they phoned my boss and asked if I'd ever designed anything before. And I was like, what do you mean? You asked for design sprints. Like, I don't understand what's going on. And so I was having a heart-to-heart with a pal, and he said, maybe they just mean this. And I'm like, oh, shit. Yeah. So I think that was what was happening. Like, they were sort of they were picking the things that they'd heard about and assuming it was something else. And so when we were doing the stuff that we were being asked for, it wasn't what they had in their heads, and we never thought to check. And so we were able to sort of we just came up with this idea of sort of less haste, more speed type thing. So we started to just break the process up a little bit, give them a bit of time for a breather. At the beginning of the different weeks, we could do some sort of homework and make sure that we had a few sort of back pocket ideas. And so it just taught us to be mindful of the language that everybody uses and not making assumptions, but also to create space for things, basically. The next project I want to tell you about is a company called a Co-op, and so after the Centre Parks thing, I was like, well, they're tricky because they obviously don't think like me at all, even though they say they do. But I knew that Co-op Digital really did think like me. Lots of my friends in the BBC had gone to work there, people from GDS had gone to work there, and I was like, yeah, they're talking about the sort of stuff that I understand. Over there it must be working. So we went over to them, and they were saying, well, we actually need some help. We haven't quite cracked it. It seems to be working in some places and not others. And so we said, okay, well, we'll do another bit of research. We'll go out and talk to a bunch of people, and we'll try and find out what's going on. So we talked to the people in Co-op Digital and said, like, how's things going? What do you think? And they said, well, we've got trouble with these people. And I was like, oh yeah? Told them the Centre Parks story. We all know the Outlook dinosaurs, don't we? The people who are kind of tied to Microsoft products, and they send emails all day and make spreadsheets and all that kind of stuff. And they're a real pain in the ass by and large, and they don't really want to work the way that we want to work. And so we sort of shared some stories about the Outlook dinosaurs and thought, yeah, well, we need to sort those people out. And then we thought, well, we'll do a bit more research and we'll find out if we can see anything else. And we found out about another group of people. Like, who are they? And it took us a little while to realise they were talking about us. And so the problem is that often, again, it's a language thing, I suppose, but you create these sort of impenetrable processes and language. And so I don't know if any of you have ever tried to join a Slack channel. Like, it can't be done. Most people think like, oh, all the designs are on Slack, that's super collaborative, everybody can see things, it's really cool. And most people haven't got a clue what he's talking about, never mind like actually getting access to it. And so just being mindful of like the people who are outside the club, I think that's the thing that we realised is that there's just a different group of people that think in a different way and have a different set of expectations and so on. And so just pushing your way of working into them and saying, well, because we have the language of Silicon Valley, that makes us somehow cooler than everybody else, just won't wash, I don't think. And so we built a thing, we made like a little guide, like a little pocket guide saying, well, if you want to work with Co-op Digital, then read this first, and it'll just give you a bit of a heads up about what it's going to be like. And there was a few sort of, I won't go through all of it, but the thing that everybody seemed to like about Co-op Digital is they provided the voice of the customer. So that was the thing that was always being left out in conversations elsewhere in the co-op. And so they really liked that the Co-op Digital team were able to put the voice of the customer into the situation. But then they sort of playing to the strengths of the people who own the business areas or whatever, and just saying, well, actually, you know way more than I do or never will about this particular thing, and so let's make sure that gets added in. Figure out the ground rules. Try and work out, like, if you pin down the cost and the time scale and exactly what you want, the chances of you getting a very good outcome are pretty unlikely. And so we just sort of talk about like the thing up front, the things that you can get wrong or make it less likely to work. But because it actually does feel a bit different, it's a messy process. You can kind of you change direction. You have to be able to talk to each other a lot. You all have to be in the same place most of the time. It doesn't really work if you have like a meetings and sort of schedule type culture. So we talked about that a little bit. Even then, there's things that it's okay to expect. This idea of like an endless beta or whatever doesn't make a lot of sense to most folks outside digital and design, I don't think. And so, reasonable expectations about how long things are expected to take, when they'll be ready, etc., I think is okay. And actually, if you don't get the relationship right and have that kind of empathy for people, then you've got no chance basically. And so, the most important thing is to be able to just create some sort of human connection with people. On we go. So another organisation came to us, Manchester Airport Group. They were saying, well, we like what you've done for Centre Parks, we like what you've done for Co-op, we want to work like that. Can you help us? We said, yeah, of course we can. Here's how we balls that up. So we said, well, first thing you need to do is have some sort of hypothesis, because that's really cool. So you say, well, like, is there something you can observe or measure in the world that means that you want to take a certain set of actions, and then you'll get a goal, and then you'll be able to get some measurable result, and you get this lovely virtuous circle of like making sure you're always commissioning the highest impact and the lowest effort piece of work. And they're like, okay, so that sounds fine. So they took all their sort of what they expected and translated it into this format for us, and that was good. And what we did was plant a little seed that in all of the time, we'll have all of the impact. And so it was just like, right, okay, that's what people are expecting. And then lots of people thought, seems reasonable to assume that the impact will come in nice 25% chunks. And it didn't. It was much more like that. And so in the end, we probably got further than they would have expected, but it sort of ramps up to it. And it reminded me of a thing that a guy called Eddie Obeng, who's smarter than me, said. He said, this thing here is the anxiety gap. So when you're further away from the position where you think you should be, from where you actually are, that creates a great amount of anxiety in people. And when people have anxiety, most of the time they try to help. So they run towards trouble because we are kind of heroic and we kind of say, right, we're not where we should be. I should interfere. And so you turn up and you just try and like jolly things along and end up making it worse, obviously, because people concentrate on that, on dealing with the stakeholder instead of delivering the work. And so closing the anxiety gap and making sure people know like where we are is okay, even if that's behind where we expect it to be, is a big part of like what we learned from this project. And we started saying, right, okay, so let's use some travel-based metaphors. It's an airport after all. So we said we're going to start sending postcards. So we're going to send this postcard to you every other day that explains where we're up to, the fact that it's fine, etc. And we use this sort of metaphor because it's really, most people, in just simple communication, the reason people send postcards to one another, or used to, is just because they want to make sure you got somewhere okay, you're having a good time, things are as you expected they would be, a little bit of a picture about what you're kind of most interested in, and when you're coming home, that kind of stuff. You know, most people just want fairly basic sort of communication, but relatively regularly. You want to stay in touch, and so most sort of status reports and like dashboards with figures on and stuff like that. It's sort of, yeah, it makes the world go round, I suppose, but there's not much soul in it, you know. Like, I think that it's important to actually just tell the story of what you're doing, and even if you've got this sort of fairly boring like structure of governance, just sending these postcards at this idea of like a drumbeat where you're kind of constantly talking about the work and about what's happening, and sharing pictures and photographs using the channels that people are actually listening to. So I would use like they basically come to expect an email from me on a Wednesday afternoon. And it means that they would wait until that email before asking us questions, etc. And so this idea of like a beat and a rhythm to the sort of storytelling became really, really important. And so we sort of felt like at this point we're starting to get it. And so here, then the BBC came back into our world at this point. They're looking for partnerships, basically. So it turns out that the way I thought about commissioning design when I was at the BBC was totally wrong, and the rest of them have figured it out since, that it's better to actually commission more of a sort of partnership type agreement. And so they tested us to get onto this roster by you couldn't get kind of to the start line without a decent portfolio of work and without basic craft and all that stuff and good process and things like that. So you could easily kind of do that, and that meant that sort of top sort of 25 businesses got into this round, and the selection process then became about like whether or not you could think differently about things, I suppose, and not get to the right answer, and most importantly, like how you treat your staff. How is it a place where people learn and want to come to work and stuff like that? And so they spent an amazing amount of time talking to the sort of junior designers in our team and finding out, you know, what they're hoping to get out of their time with us, and we're like, shit, like, hope they don't. And they saved the day, a lot of them, because they said cool stuff that I kind of wouldn't have been able to. And so it was quite interesting where they didn't just look at the output. It wasn't the thing that they valued. They did value that really high, but in equal height other things. So there's a bunch of us in this roster. So we're there with other organisations that you've heard about, and they're all fab, and they're all kind of different, and we kind of fit together like a kind of happy little family. And we've done lots of cool work. So we did a nice little project on the top left, which was for another one in children's, about a club type experience to get more routine behaviour. We did a sort of storytelling strategy type bit about what the world could be like if the BBC changed the way that it worked. We did a nice little nerdy sort of icon project where we took the new font that they produced and see if we could pick bits of that and build icons out of them. And the bottom right one is a documentary we're making about studio culture. So we're doing field trips around different studios and finding out how they work and why they do things. So a real mix. It's dead easy to commission. None of them, like, you don't have to pitch for any of them. And so we're sort of flying, really, doing lots of nice work with the BBC. And we came across this project, which was for an Alexa skill to allow people to learn the art of small talk from the world's most articulate people. That sounds pretty cool. And like, so we were all involved together in the ideation process for that, and we came up with this sort of world-beating sort of proposition about how the BBC could exploit this technology in a way that solves a real-world problem. And so if you, how articulate you are really affects your sort of successes in life. And if you don't hear enough words when you're very young, you never make the gap. And so basically, kind of helping the nation become better at kind of speaking to one another is actually really, really important, and only the BBC can really do that because of the people that it employs and its remit and etc. And so we showed this to a few folks, and they were kind of obviously super excited, as were we. And so the next thing we said was like, right, let's get it prototyped. It's really easy. Build an Alexa skill, get it in front of some people, test it all out. And it didn't work at all. And so the none of the things that we wanted Alexa to do, the technology wasn't capable of. The people that we spoke to weren't. They said, "Oh, I don't want to talk to this robot about this sort of stuff." I want, you know. And so it was like, "Oh no." And so we were left with like, we'd been involved in like inflating this idea basically, and we were left with what felt like a really difficult kind of message. And so here comes the fear again, because it was like, "Oh no, what am I going to do now?" I've kind of I feel like I've sort of set us up for a fall, really. And I spoke to an old friend at the BBC about it, and he said, well, actually, like, that's a pretty cool thing, because most of the time the client just want a position on something. They're very happy to sort of say, well, it's more of a not yet than a no, you know. And so actually, just what we were able to do in that project is really quickly kind of get to the answer. And so the no became something that was actually a really good outcome. Otherwise, they'd have just dragged this project on, and the old way of commissioning it would have meant that we'd have inherited a project that couldn't have been delivered. The audience didn't want it anyway, and so we'd actually only spent like $5,000 or something ridiculous. It was a tiny amount of money, and actually doing the engineering would have been tens of thousands of pounds. And so we realised that this idea of like getting to a position and being able to make a decision on a piece of technology was really important. And so I asked my pal, like, he works in BBC Sport, like what's on your mind? Are there other things that you get asked for, like Alexa skills, that you kind of can't shake off, but you don't have time to work on either? And he said, yeah, there are. And it's not just me. There's the exec product manager and the technology people and the editorial folks and marketing, and we all have this like big like list of like things that we can't get to. And so we did a bit of an amnesty. We invited them all into the studio and said, just bring like all of the big ideas, bring everything that you've heard about, things that ridiculous kind of high up folks have asked for, or stuff that ideas you've had yourself and you've just never been able to get to. And we narrowed them right down into these 7 things and just picked one almost at random and thought, right, okay, what we're going to do is invent a new way of addressing these sorts of things. And so here's a drum roll. We came up with this diagram. It's pretty nice, isn't it? On the right is the thing that all organizations can do, which is most digital organizations anyway, get into this loop of build, measure, learn. So they'll basically build a new thing, measure that it's working, learn from that, and then decide what to do next. And so MAG were doing a good example of that, where they're just continuously improving things. And two tricky things happen. The first thing is the businesses tend to get hooked on the right-hand side because it's a bit more predictable, and it's sort of working, and everybody knows how that works. And so we tend to do more of that. And what happens is you end up with sort of diminishing returns. So it's harder and harder to make the same gains that you did early on. So people start to fall out eventually, but you get hooked on that anyway. And on the left-hand side, nobody's ever really written down what you're supposed to do. So that's the sort of foggy, like discovery type bit where like you can't. There aren't really any books about how to. There's loads of books on sort of agile and how to run sort of design teams and build things when you know what you want. But if you don't know and you just know you need to do something, nobody's got any idea. And so it's like, oh Christ. So we're gonna have to figure that out. But we thought, well, actually, let's just, from what we've learned before, we're gonna have to have. Yeah, this is a confession, I suppose. Like governance and like decision making. I guess if I thought one day that I'd tell you guys that was important, I'd just walk into the sea in the 90s probably. But now I think actually it is quite important. The ability to make decisions collectively as an organisation and find some method of doing and agreeing on how things get done, even though it feels bureaucratic, is actually quite important. And so the first kind of know that this process gives you is just good old-fashioned strategy. Like knowing what you actually stand for as an organisation, what your brand sort of promises to people, what that experience is, means that you don't then chase the competition or chase the latest technology or whatever. Just being able to say why you might let a particular concept into your world and saying no to things straight away has to be based on your strategy. So folks who say that strategy is dead, I think, are wrong. The other one is quickly finding out that you're it's not right, it's not yet. So that the Lex idea is a bit like that. So we sort of went through a very quick process to figure out. It's basically a prototyping exercise to figure out if something can work, and then as a result, is it more important to press on with this? Is people get this sort of sunk cost fallacy where they'll keep working on something because they've put so much effort into it so far, and so letting things go or parking them as quickly as possible is the next no. Some things just need more time. Again, like I think a lot of the time, if I ever sort of commissioned sort of discovery work when I was at the BBC, it tended to be quite big scale things, lots and lots of methods all racked together. In the end, a great big report with all the information in. It's much better to break that down into cycles, even though it's risky as a business to sort of say, well, we'll just take the sort of project in sort of 5 or 10 grand slices. You get much more chance to sort of change direction and so on. And so it's better, I think, to work in iterations, even if you're in this sort of discovery thing. And then finally, you can strike across things that you think have got potential, but then that means saying no to something else. So there's everybody has a sort of fixed set of resource, and so saying no to something you're doing instead is actually then becomes the hardest part. So it's really easy, I think, as a design team to just create a great big pile of like ideas that ready for development or something. But what's the point of that? Like if you've just like I just sort of quite often you get sort of teams making pictures of things. It's like, well, if we had the opportunity to build it, it would look like this. It's like, well, that's cool, but let's focus on what we're actually building, what we're actually delivering to people. And if we have new ideas which we think are better, then let's do those instead and not be too hung up about it. And so we got quite excited about this diagram. It felt like it was a system that we could use to sort of start to govern some of these more foggy or fluffy sort of projects. And we wrote it all down in this little presentation, called it Continuous Innovation. And we took it to the sort of senior people at the BBC and said, like, we've come up with this really cool thing, and this is the first slide. And the most senior person in the room stopped us on this slide and said, why have we got an agency working on innovation for us? And it was just like I just seem to be cursed to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. I don't know why I do it. Like, I sort of feel like I was so excited about that we'd struck on something, and I wanted to sort of be famous for it. So I put the code branding on it, and so we made this, And I just forgot that rule number one is that's not the point. You need to make the organisation that you work for more effective, and it was through that brief that we were able to come up with all of this sort of stuff. And so just trying to talk to people through the language that they use, and using the branding that they recognise, because actually it's the sort of again, it's sort of quite an old-fashioned idea really, but somehow I keep forgetting it. And so that we managed to sort of get through that. And they did actually commission a first project. And so the project was all about interactive video. So the BBC's created some new technology that means they can make much more live streamed content, basically. It's a bit like Facebook Live. But the content is not going to be always sort of the super kind of editorial edited World Cup final type stuff. It'll be like people playing cricket and people kind of waiting outside Downing Street, and it'd just be like live streams of a lot of stuff. So you can't rely on the sort of editorial experience in the content to keep people interested. And so they wanted to think about what you could pair with that, like from an interactive perspective, to keep people more engaged and active while they're watching it, so that if something does happen interesting, that they're there when it happens. And so we're like, okay, so we can help with that. We've got our favourite old methods toolkit that we know will work, and we can quite easily kind of put together a quick plan, so we can get going pretty quick. We've done lots of projects for the BBC before, and so we know how they like to work. The strategy bit was super important, so we worked up front with their stakeholders to make sure we were really clear about what the BBC's take on this thing would be. And so it meant that we could rule a lot of stuff out because we had the strategy in place. It was around the time of the Champions League final, so we looked at what other organisations were doing. You got people like inside the ground actually live filming things and reacting to that. On Twitter there would be sort of talent. Essentially this is Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain was given the sort of control of Liverpool's social media during the game. BT Sport put it on YouTube, and you could watch it there. On the right there's the sort of comment stream, which the BBC was sure that they would need, but then when we showed them like an event that was happening at a BBC scale, it's impossible. The stuff on the right just whizzes by at such a ridiculous speed, you can't actually get anything out of it. I think you can see me somewhere saying "Go on Liverpool," but that was about as much as I could type. And so we sort of were able to sort of just figure out what the market was doing, and then rule in or out what things might be useful based on the BBC strategy. We worked really hard to make the creative process as inclusive as possible, so we sketched all these little storyboards in advance and got people to cut out post-it notes and put the interface on top. And so we sort of made it really flat in the way that you didn't have to be able to use any of the prototyping tools or any of the you don't need to use Illustrator or any of that sort of stuff in order to make these ideas get worked up. And so once we got to this, we were able to sort of say, okay, well, which of these things do we think stands out the most? And we took that through into the next stage. So in order to test them, I was nervous because I thought, well, prototyping video experiences, particularly around live, is going to be really tough. And then we realised, actually, well, let's just play a video in an iPad and put like these acetates over top of it. And it meant we were able to test much more stuff much more quickly and not get so attached to things. And so we tested that with a bunch of people, and they said all sorts of interesting things, because the the objective of the testing, again, when you do stuff in a lab, it looks normally like you're trying to validate something and try and make sure that an idea is good or not. And actually what we're trying to do is see if people could recognize the value in the functionality based on their own lives. And so things like when you see people getting up and leaving, it makes you think that you should leave too. So that's the idea of people leaving a football ground at the end of a match. You think, oh, maybe I should go because of the transport or whatever. And so maybe there was ideas about like showing the number of people that were watching and having that number go up and down, so like surges of people either leaving or joining might be a valuable thing. And then you see the lots of social proof. If people weren't enjoying themselves, they wouldn't be watching it. So there's data about like the audiences. It becomes a valuable thing that you can put into the user experience. And so we ended up with a boatload of kind of insights and a bunch of prototypes and stuff like this. And I was like, okay, so then I was back at work trying to kind of get all the toys back in the box and thinking, well, what do I do now? Like my sort of instinct as a design director is to pull all this together into some sort of interesting sort of final sort of statement or whatever, and maybe take some of the ideas and work them up a little bit into sort of what the future might look like, make them a little bit more jazzy. And so I got the fear again, because I was thinking, well, I'm a bit stuck. Like I'm pretty sure that's not the right thing to do, but I don't know what to do instead. And so I phoned my mate and said, I've done about half of the presentation, and now I'm stuck, and I don't know what to do. And he, in his wisdom, said, well, don't worry, that's fine. Just bring what you've got in, and we'll do the rest together. And that sounded so obvious that I was like, yeah, okay, let's do that then. And so then we just worked on it as a team, basically. So we sketched out the next bits, and they said, well, we need to start thinking about kind of audience profiling and figuring out kind of which audience might work. We need to know from all of the insights we've got, are there some guidelines or sort of rules that we can follow when we implement this stuff in future? So rather than try to implement the ideas that are in your document, we'll just need some guidance that's based on the insight. That means we can evaluate the future designs. And all of the value of the final presentation came out of that session. Everything I'd written up to that point was just a sort of summary, if you know what I mean. And I was trying to sort of add the value on my own, because I thought that was my job. And actually, it was more about trying to find out from the organisation what they needed to see from the work that we'd done. And so there's a real nervousness about showing something that's half completed, because it makes you feel like you've not done enough, you know. And so I sort of figured that out on this particular project. You're probably thinking this, I guess, at the moment, that in your own organisation, the sort of stuff that I'm talking about wouldn't work for all sorts of different reasons. And often people say, well, the BBC is different, isn't it? It's funded differently. The people who work there think differently, and so on. And some of that is true, obviously. But the thing that I was kind of proud of is that we did this project at a really, really busy time. So this is over the summer when the World Cup was on, which the BBC can't afford to get that wrong. So all the designers and engineers and product people at BBC are busy during these periods, because this stuff has to be right. And the way that we were able to make that happen was by earlier in the summer helping them through some of the sort of churn, some of the work that had to be done to deliver things, which created the opportunity for them to work with us later in the summer in order to do this particular project. So again, unfortunately, it just comes down to basic stuff like planning. And so all the way through this, I've sort of learned is just, again, these sort of things that just keep coming back over and over again that I keep forgetting. And the first one is like partnership. I think as whether you work for a client or whether you work in agencies, I think that the how you work with a supplier has to move away from that sort of we're asking you to provide this thing and then we'll sign it off and all that kind of stuff. We've got to find a better way to commission creative services, and the only way that's going to work is if you build trust. And so doing what you said you would do, delivering things consistently at high standard, creates an opportunity for the next project, not sort of just trying to grab the whole thing but take it a piece at a time. I think that sort of stuff just builds trust in an organisation, and they know that you're working in their interests. And so we were able to do that through our work with the BBC. The mag stuff I talked about is, again, it's basically stuff, but just like an openness really, and not working behind your hand. Again, I think there's a tendency in agencies in particular to overwork things to a point because they think they have to take to that sort of thing, or they just disappear for 3 weeks while they're trying to figure something out, and they forget that there's somebody in the client kind of wondering what's going on. And so basically being open and having this continuous kind of dialogue that lets people kind of direct things. I think having small bits of direction along the way is far better than a big list at the end. and so that's that. I think you have to work on the whole self thing. I think there's a certain expectation from an organization when they hire a business like Code or any other that they get a certain sort of mindset or way of working, which is true. They get skills and a mindset, but then they also you have to build those sort of human relationships and sort of understand what it must be like to work in these different organizations, and if you can actually go and experience that for yourself, because you only really see the things, and people can't tell you what it's like because they never think to mention it. And so actually going into these organizations and working yourself is crucial. And the thing that I thought would save us at the beginning was just process. I thought that was the thing that basically I could be kind of famous for, and the craft in actually delivering that sort of stuff, and the work that follows it. And I think that underpins everything that we do. But it's just the beginning, really. If you can't get the other things right, you're probably not going to make much progress. And so if you work on all those things and just try and think differently about the world, I think you've got a chance of doing new things. That's the end. Thank you.